All right, this is the fourth segment of Women in Sports, and welcome. My name is Alexandra Allred. I am an adjunct professor at Charleston State University with the Department of Kinesiology. This is the fourth segment, so if you haven't seen the other ones, you might want to go back and check it out. If you are a student, then you're right where you're supposed to be. If you're just kind of looking around, you're interested about the history of women in sport, then welcome, and definitely go back to see the intro to get an idea of what this is all about. But we're going to jump in, as we've talked about so often in the previous segments, is it with the history of women in sport, it took not just white women, but women of elite status to be able to push the envelope to kind of get us to where we are. And so we can't tell history without giving the full scope of how it all came about. So this is the chapter on white women in sport, how it all began. So it is a privileged few, and as we talked about a couple of segments ago, it took the daughter of a Spartan king to be able to break into the very first Olympic Games, and it also took the Queen of Scots to be able to be the first woman to play golf. And so you want more details, it's in the book, it's a really great story, but she coined the term caddy, that came from cadets who helped assist her while she was playing. And so, but this is just the beginning of women who we had to determine based on behavior who could play sports and what the sports actually were. And so it was considered, if it was light, if it was archery, if it was golf, these were considered tennis eventually. These are a lot of the sports that were allowable for the elite, the women of leisure. And so it wasn't anything that was going to hurt the hegemonic feminine ideal that is so important to social structures under patriarchy. And we've talked about that before, but you're going to see that this does continue for a while. It wasn't until 1811, after couple centuries after the Queen of Scots, that the women were allowed to participate in any kind of tournament. But even then, it wouldn't be until 1934 that 1950 that the LPGA was organized and women could have more access to the golf courses, which, if you watched the intro, I talked about me as a bobsledder. Even though I was named a national champion, it doesn't mean anything if you're not allowed to get on the ice and you don't have a sled. So a lot of the times when we see on paper that women were allowed to do certain sports, they were allowed to do the sports, but then they weren't given the opportunities. So things started to shift, though, during the 1830s. It wasn't just in Britain, but in the United States that there was the industrialization began to change a lot of things, from the size of the family. We used to have 6 to 8 kids who lived in their rural settings. They worked the farms, and it quickly moved to 2 to 4 kids, and more families were moving into the cities. And as they did, more and more women saw two things. They wanted to work and they wanted to have an education. And this became highly problematic because this changed how we saw the family unit, but also how we saw our communities. And so patriarchal leaders were starting to get a little concerned about the shift that they saw. And it wasn't just President Roosevelt, but in 1905, he actually publicly called out for white women, to start having more babies because they were so concerned about the immigration that was happening. But Roosevelt personally chastised fathers for allowing their daughters to get education, saying that they were committing race suicide. So we've heard these terms coming back up in 2016, 17, 18. It's not new. We've heard this before. So we're taking a look at the same time, the battle was going on in the sport world of who was allowed to enter into the sports. And so you can see on the chart, by 1896, it was the first modern Olympic Games. Women weren't allowed. But the pressure was building, and so we saw more and more women were climbing mountains, and they were air balloonists and piloting airplanes, and more women were becoming visible in the media, and so it was becoming problematic to exclude women from sport, because we were seeing that they could do certain things. So I'll let you take a moment and look at the chart, and you're going to notice how many times a sport was in and then it was out, and then it was in and then it was out. Because every time they had the games, then there was this backlash from the patriarchal leaders saying, we didn't like how she was moving. We didn't like the way she looked in her clothing when she was doing XYZ. And so they would pull it back out. But it's also important to note that the father of the modern Olympics, Coubertin, did not believe that women had any place in sport, and he said many times, the only reason a maiden should be in the Olympic arena is when she's giving the medal to the champion. That was the only place for a female in that regard. So it was a tough go for very persistent female athletes. And I got to tell you, when I was doing research for this book, there are so many stories that I would actually my heart would swell, because I would see how hard it was for them, not just to get into that sport, but the backlash that they would get. Articles in newspapers and periodicals and magazines that would call them out by name, shaming them and calling them all kinds of names and going after their family for allowing them to behave that way. And a lot of times you look at what's going on with the women in Afghanistan since the Taliban came in and the women's soccer team had to go into hiding. A lot of the things that we read in the 1800s that were directed toward American women by American leaders and neighbors is similar to what's happening to the women in Afghanistan, who subsequently have fled their country and are now playing in, I believe, Australia. But you can see that this is an unbelievable history that this was happening, and it would go on and on. But one of the standouts that really needs a special slide all to herself is Kellerman. So Annette Kellerman was the first recognized Olympic swimmer. But more than that, she changed bathing suits and what they looked like. So there was, in 1904, there was a steamboat that the engine took fire and it sank. And as it was sinking, witnesses saw all these women and children were not jumping overboard. And they couldn't understand, and they were yelling to these women, jump, and many of them caught on fire before they actually did jump. But in the end, when they all jumped at some point, there was almost 1,000 drownings of women and children, because the men didn't understand how heavy the women's clothing was. And then wet, they simply drowned. But also, they didn't know how to swim in the first place, because in many places, swimming for women was not tolerated. It wasn't socially acceptable. But in the few places where women bathing, they called it, were allowed to go into the water, they still had to wear the traditional bathing suit at that time, which when wet could weigh up to 30 pounds. The lighter ones, women would then sew weights into the hem of the dress, because they were afraid that the wind would blow it up and they'd be seen in their bloomers, which of course was not ladylike at all. And so they would go into the water with these heavy bathing suits, or literally weighted, and then drown. So it wasn't until that steamboat incident that they finally started a campaign called Learn to Swim. Ladies learn to swim. But it still never really occurred to them that maybe this weight, the clothing, was a problem. So along comes Annette Kellerman, who had, strictly for swimming purposes, because she was a competitive swimmer in Australia, had designed her own suit. When she came to the United States wearing it, she was immediately arrested for indecent exposure. But eventually, that suit would take on and gained popularity with women who, not being funny, were tired of almost drowning. And so this was the beginning of the acceptance of how women could dress. At the same time, then we also had more daring women. I'll let you look at the slide. But in particular, one of my favorites is, Annie Smith Peck is an amazing woman. But Eleanor Sears was quite the character, and again, extremely wealthy, as was Amelia Earhart. So many families that had the prestige. And I'm sorry, I said Amelia Earhart. I didn't mean to say that. Anyway. Sorry, got distracted myself. So Eleonora, absolutely love her because she was the first woman on record to fight a speeding ticket, but she also purposely got herself, she wasn't a smoker, but she purposely went out into the street outside of a club where they were and was smoking a cigarette to get herself arrested because she just wanted to make a point of how ludicrous this was, that men were smoking everywhere but women couldn't smoke. And so these are the kind of pioneers that began to just really open the doors for everyone. But every single time, every step of the way, there was the pushback. And in the case of Ida Schnall, she was a phenomenal athlete. She was in just so many sports, and she was a phenomenal athlete. But it just so happened that she played baseball, but she was a great swimmer, and she wanted to go into the Olympics. I think it was 1912, yes. And it just so happens that the founder of the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union, but also he had really tight connections with the USOC. He absolutely did not, like the father of the modern Olympics, he did not think that women had any place in sports. And so he absolutely fought not just Schnall, but anyone going to the 1912 games. He couldn't stop the women from being in the games, but he could stop U.S. women. So he actually knew that Ida was slated to win gold, but he made sure that no American woman could go and participate in the 1912 games just to kind of stop that. And it's not a surprise that James Sullivan was, he had some pretty misogynistic and racist views along the board. He was all about just white male superiority. And if you go back and you really look at the history of the modern day Olympics, that's why they were recreated. And they were brought back as to bring about not just male superiority, but white male superiority. This might make some of my listeners here uncomfortable, but you got to understand where we started and why the struggle was so much for so many, and then appreciate all the achievements as they go on. By the time we got to the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, women were really coming out. The Edmonton Grads, a Canadian basketball team, and to this day, nobody can beat their record. They dominated. And we had more and more women coming out. But at this time, Sullivan had passed away, I think 1916, and so that left Coubertin to be the guy fighting for women to get into the games. But he was, and I, in great detail in the book I talk about, but he was not prepared for this one French woman who loved rowing and had a vision that maybe women could enter into more sports, but in particular, she really wanted to get rowing in. And her quote was, "I came against a solid wall of refusal," because he had no intention of letting any more women than had already been allowed in. And so she came up with the idea she would start the Women's Olympics. And it was so popular that it forced the IOC, the International Olympic Committee's hand. They really had no choice. And eventually, after a lot of negotiation, then they folded in the women's sports back into the IOC. And while some women were restricted from those initial Women's Olympic Games, it was what Alice wanted from the get-go, is she just wanted to make sure that women had their place in the Olympic Games as well, and so mission accomplished. But again, there was always the image. And the media image, I talk about this so much, it's so important to talk about because every little step of the way in women in sports, the image of the female athlete was so incredibly important. And so also in the 1920s, when women are making these great strides in sports, right, there were the Gibson girls. And so the Gibson girls, you'll see on the slide on the left, is, only her hands and her face are exposed. There was great detail put into the way her hair was styled. And then along comes the Roaring Twenties, and these women who have, after the World War I, a lot of them have worked and they've helped in the military setting, and they don't want to go back to the way things were. They like the freedom of clothing. They want to wear pants. They cut their hair short. They start wearing makeup. They start smoking and drinking and dancing into the night. And it was, again, just like the bicycle was so astonishing to so many, the Roaring Twenties was a very shocking time for patriarchal leaders who couldn't understand why this shift that was coming. And for the first time, women weren't getting married at a very young age, and women are showing more interest in education. All scary stuff. And then comes Gertrude Ederle, called America's Best Girl. And I'll let you take a moment and look at the slide. But what is so amazing about her is she too did not fit the feminine ideal. She was considered, what was repeatedly said in the media, is a big girl or a sturdy girl, because at 5'5" she weighed 140 pounds, I think. And for a lot of people, and they loved her, but it was always important to make note of her size. And maybe this was an explanation as to why she didn't have an interest in getting married. And there was other ideas that maybe there were other reasons why she decided not to get married. But this woman, not only did she design her own goggles, but and by now you've already seen that the very first time her first coach, who had had 22 unsuccessful attempts, when it was pretty clear that she was doing well, he reached out and touched her and disqualified her. She comes back and she becomes the first woman to swim across the English Channel, but also she beats all the men's times. And she is so popular that millions show up to see her when she comes back to the United States and cheers her and loves her. And so for the first time, there becomes a little bit of a shift in not only the capabilities of women, but then also what she can look like, and that we can call her America's girl and love her. So these are really important things. The last thing to consider is scholarships, and we're going to get into that a little bit later, but we're a long way off from women getting their scholarships. But the reason that education is also important is because the educational institutions were the first to start women's teams. And then we started to see that we could have female team players. And a lot of the negative stereotypes that always fell off of, and we hear this today, you know how girls are, you know how girls can be. And then when they started to see that these female athletes were fully capable, they loved each other, they did well together, there was a camaraderie, and then they started getting stronger and they became more fit, and all of these things started happening. There was this snowball effect that started to change where we were headed. And so I'll wrap up with that, but we've got to, before I can move forward, I got to go back a little bit in the next segment to talk about the women who weren't white and did not have elitist status in the system in which we were living. But we're heading there for some really great stuff. So stick with me. We're going to go to the next segment. And so for my students, this segment right here is going to be chapters 4, 5, and 6 from the book. If you're new and you just want to look at women in sports, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here, and I invite you to go back and look at the other segments. But this one is women of color and their place in the women's movement and in sports. My name is Alexandra Allred, and I am an adjunct professor at Tarleton State University with the Department of Kinesiology. And I've got to say, this is one of my favorite chapters because all too often we don't teach the fullness of women's sports history, and it is deeply complicated and heartbreaking and empowering, and the entirety of women's sports history needs to be told. In doing that, we got to roll it back a little bit, and we have to talk about women's rights movement and who was considered allowable in women's rights movements, which is kind of shocking to think about, but these are the realities. And my dream here is that when we talk about these kind of things and we put it out there, that we can do a better job of empowering everyone for all the right reasons, and not just empowering girls either, but also boys. And so I believe that even though this is women in sports history, that if all people would learn the history here, we could see what we did wrong, but we can also see what we're doing right, and make the world a better place. Corny, but sincere. Okay, so that said, we'll start with the women's rights movement, which the watershed moment it took place in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, in which a small group of women who came from an elite status, so they knew that they were able to take to a platform and say some of the stuff that they did. They did. They took to the platform and said, this is what we need to do, and really set in motion around the world the idea that women could and should fight for equal status. And not too long after that, New Zealand actually showed the world how it could be done. And so the irony is it started in the United States, and a lot of other countries passed us by. But we started it. But again, it was the elite few that started it. But it's really important to understand that as women did get voting rights, we like to think that this blanket idea of just all women got voting rights. They did not. And so a lot of countries, not just the United States, but a lot of countries would then choose, based upon your education and your race and your social status, if you were able to vote. And so this sort of begins the bridge, or I should say the division on who was equal, who had rights and who didn't. And the 19th Amendment and the Voting Acts of 1865 took aim at state and local restrictions for not just black men, but black women as well. And so why this matters in sports is because if we as a people are okay to say, well, then some people can vote and some people can't, well, then of course we're going to say some people can come in the club and do sports and some can't. And so this was really the beginning of figuring out who actually had rights in this country and who didn't. And I've said it in so many of the other segments, but it took white women to get the sports momentum going. But here we are in the fight for women's rights. And Alice Paul, actually, when the women showed up in Washington, D.C., and they were going to march at 1913, the day before the inauguration of our new president, they wanted to be seen. And so one of the things that they determined, as Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul decided, we want to be an all-white delegation. And so they actively went to the black activists to say, well, we want you to march in the back. Enter Ida B. Jones, who no way was she going to do this. And looking at her history, she was born into slavery. She was a progressive black abolitionist. She owned her own newspaper, and she was actually the first black woman to be thrown off of public transport when she had purchased a ticket on a train. And then when all the first class and all the other trains filled up, they tried to make her go all the way back to the back into the smoking section, which she actively didn't want to go to. And when she showed them her ticket, that she bought a first class ticket to be where she was and had the right, she was arrested and thrown off the train. So this is not a woman fearful of anything. And so she waited for her opportunity. And as that delegation marched, she stepped out from a side street and then wound up leading the delegation. And so these are the critical people in non-white history who showed us that they weren't going to take a back seat, and they had every right to be a representative of the history of the equal rights that they thought that they deserved as well. It was 1945 that Eleanor Roosevelt helped to oversee the establishment of the United Nations, and specifically drafting the Declaration of Human Rights. And this is critically important because Eleanor Roosevelt did a great job of making sure that all people were considered, not just, and ironically, she was an elite white woman, but she wanted to make sure that everybody had equal status. And so from here, for the first time, we really started to see in more modern times just what the treatment was. And Bring Back Our Girls was, I don't know, many of you are too young, but in Nigeria, when literally 300 plus girls were kidnapped in the middle of the night and taken on as wives, including in polygamous relationships, but also slaves. Many were killed. And so it became this whole movement of this international movement of bringing back our girls. But it's so important. Equality is so important because it's not just about me getting in a bobsled and having my time on the ice. It isn't, and it's more than just words, is because when we do not give equal status to people, any people, all people, then those are the people, the marginalized people, who also have more violence in their lives. And so this it's so important, it's so critically important to talk about the legal issues in that equal to humanity. And I get a little tongue-tied because I get really it's difficult for me to believe that even in 2022, some of these things are still happening to so many populations, including, and we will get to this much later in the segment, the series of Indigenous women who go missing. And only recently, because it's become kind of trendy, people are paying attention to this. But before there was advocacy, before we had our hashtags and we talked about all this, in particular, what women of color went through was a very different experience and very different history than the white women that we're always taught in school. By 1870, black men had the vote, but women did not. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, it's important to understand that they went out of their way to make sure that they got the vote before even black men. And when they say they and women, they're talking about white women before any black people. And so Lucy Stone and Sojourner Truth, also a former slave, Truth, they separated. And this is when there's a split, and a critically important split in the women's movement. And when there's that split, then we start to see more of the superheroes that you were never really taught about. And that's Mary Ann Shadd Cary and Haley Quinn Brown, Nanny you can look on the slide. But in the book, I go into detail about who these women were and how strong they were and what great advocates they were for everyone. And their work and the groundwork that they put down is really what led for women to be able to get into sports. But in particular, I'll take a moment and tell you that on a personal note, with great pride and joy, my father was inducted into the U.S. Army Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. And when he went in the summer of 2020, he was joined, 2021, I'm sorry, he was joined by the induction of Harriet Tubman. And I always loved Harriet Tubman and did a great deal of studying on her. But I was surprised when I went to the induction of the Hall of Fame and I met her grandniece. But I learned so much about Harriet Tubman that we never even knew, even with all the research that I've done, is how critically important she was in espionage and spy work for the U.S. Army and military intelligence. And so it just goes to what I learned over time. We have conveniently written a lot of women out of history because it just doesn't gel with what we teach or the message that we want to put out there. But in particular to Tubman, it was a U.S. Army colonel who rewrote what her contributions were and what it is that she did. And as you know, we mostly know her as the conductor of the Underground Railroad, but what she did in terms of intelligence gathering among slaves in that area helped bring down the Confederate Army. And so he rewrote her history and took it on as his own. And so congrats to the U.S. Army for being willing to recognize some of this and induct her into the Hall of Fame. But back on course, in November 1917, the Silent Sentinels, as they are known, protested outside the White House. And they just really wanted to bring attention. And it was written that it never would have occurred to white women that they would have been arrested and beaten while in jail, and in fact, that's what happened. And so this small group of white women were arrested, and so angry were the jail keepers that these white women would not let this whole women's right thing drop, that they began beating the women, and it was named in the newspapers as the Night of Terror. And mainstream America was outraged when they found out what happened to these women, and very quickly the case was thrown out, and it was established that they were illegally arrested, and shame on all of you for doing that. And then just sort of to really get rid of this, it was both the Senate and the House then quickly passed the 19th Amendment. And that's how that happened. But then we look at what happens in 1926. Black women who now legally have the vote, when they show up to vote, they're beaten by elected officials who do want to make sure that they're not happy that white women are voting, but they damn sure ain't happy that what black women are voting. And so this can't be a surprise. And I teach these unhappy events because it helps us understand then why it took so long for white women to get in, for black women to get into sports, and for Hispanic, Latina women to get into sports. And it's not because they weren't interested. And just as I read in another segment to you all that prior to Title IX, only 7% of American girls were engaged in sports. But then after Title IX, now we have 43% of girls. And a lot of times we like to say, well, girls and women aren't that interested in sports. Black girls and black women were very interested in sports, but they just really weren't allowed. And so they kind of had to find their own way to get into sports. And so they used churches and the local communities, and they used racetracks, and they had unofficial races, and they were constantly competing, but their records really don't show because it took a pretty long time for them to be allowed into sports. Too few know, well, by the 1920s, individual athletic scholarships were given to white women in education, but it's going to be quite a while before we allow black women. And the first black woman, Alice Coachman, was given that by the Tuskegee Institute in 1939, which actually is ahead of a lot of other female minority experiences. But it was truly the stars, the women of color, those stars were born not from mainstream media, but black-owned newspapers and media outlets who popularized a lot of these women and kind of got them ready to go into mainstream. At the 1904 State Fair. So in 1904, it coincided with the Olympic Games, and somebody came up with the idea. Actually, it's not somebody. Coberton and Sullivan. They come up with the idea that they're going to have these tribal wars, and they had indigenous people from around the world who had come to visit the state fair, and they cherry-picked some of these athletes and decided to throw them against trained athletes and had them do wrestling, boxing, swimming, cycling, and track and field. So no surprise, they did terribly because they didn't know the rules. They'd never done the sport before. They didn't know how to do a lot of the things. And so when the white male athletes all won, they took this as a sign of superiority. And so, of course, this is ludicrous. But at the same time, it wasn't lost on the media that a lot of prominent black athletes were starting to take notice, and in particular, black female athletes. And it was the, what are they called? I'm sorry, the Romer girls. And the Romer girls were, they didn't just play against women, they played against men as well, and really became very, very popular. And by that time, it was getting harder and harder to deny that these women could make it into sports. In the next section, I will talk about the greatest female athlete. She's in many of you, the Babe, so many of you will know who she is. But you're going to hear some pretty unsettling stories about her behavior when some of the first black female athletes joined the first ever women's track team. So, but I want to shift over to Latinas. So as we talked about some of the women like Ida B. Jones, who were phenomenal women in their right and taking on fights that a lot of our white pioneer women did not have to take on. I want to introduce you to two women in particular in Latina history, and that is Ida Juarez, and she is amazing, and then also Carmelita Torres. But for Juarez, I'll let you take a look, but they called them the Juan Crow laws, and so not the Jim Crow, but the Juan Crow laws. And it was very typical in this time frame for the KKK and elected officials and even Texas Rangers to beat and hang and drag behind horses Mexican that if they thought that in some way they had stepped out of line, but mostly when it came to voting rights. And so Juarez helped form the first Mexican Congress, and in particular the League of Mexican Women. But what I love so much about her is that she and her family started their own newspaper, and she began writing about the injustices that were happening when legal Mexican Americans were trying to vote, and what was happening there. But the other woman that you need to know about is just 17 years old, and at the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, a lot of people came over the border to work day jobs in the United States, and so it became policy that they were fumigated, and this is where the term "dirty Mexican" comes from. And they were fumigated. It was gasoline baths that basically they washed them down every day, and it was causing a lot of health issues. It was incredibly dangerous and painful. But also when Carmelita Torres found out that across the street where the U.S. border workers, there was a cantina, and they found out that a lot of the women were being photographed naked and posted up this local cantina. So basically for all their own neighbors and family to see. She had had enough, and she led a protest of over 200 women and helped change the laws. And this is really critically important, again, is because the treatment of these women, of these people, is very much a part of our history, and then has everything to do with then how we're treated. I took this picture, the top left picture, that little image you see is Ida Juarez, and she's standing outside of her newspaper when she had written an article about how the treatment of Mexican Americans voting, and the governor of Texas was so displeased by this that he sent out Texas Rangers to burn down the newspaper. And she, I think she's like 5'2", and she stood out there, hands on hips, and read them her constitutional rights and the freedom of press, which you gotta love. But unlike black women and white women, there is a really complicated history with Latina women in their image. The La Adelita, which was one of the most popular ballads during the Mexican Revolution, and from that ballad came this image, and she was this empowered warrior, and she was fearless, and she was a true patriot, but at the same time she was very hypersexualized, and she was buxom and beautiful. And so in the black and white image, I have an illustration of what true Adelitas looked like, but there was this image that pursued Latina women for so long and made it really difficult, and again, very strict patriarchal ideals of what femininity is. And so her journey was in many ways more complicated than, far more complicated than the elite white woman, but also the black woman as well. And so she was just overlooked. I mean, in history, the Latina woman has always been overlooked. One of my favorite early athletes is Margarita Montes, and people call her the Latina babe. But the reality is that she was here before the babe was, and so early in the 1920s, she was boxing, and she was a bullfighter, extraordinary woman, but very little attention has ever been given to her. For the most part, the entrance of Asian, indigenous, and Latina women, Hispanic women coming into sports has just been really kind of overlooked. But if you know anything about the sport, take a look at the slide. If you know anything about this, it is madness. It is absolute madness. And for those of you who've missed some of the first intros, I was the first U.S. women's bobsled champion for the United States, and I did bobsledding, and I'm here to tell you that that's an absolute brutal and insane sport. And I had the great honor to go and watching some of these practices and competitions. And this sport is escaramuza. I hope I said that right. Chara. It's an incredible sport. And basically it's these women, and they sit side saddle. They sit side saddle and they have their horses just inches from one another, and they're going at full gallop, and they do these intricate patterns. And this is the one sport that by 1992, women were finally allowed to have this sport. While attending a couple of competitions, I got to speak to some cowboys, and they said absolutely they would never do this. And so, but look at what they're wearing for this sport. And it's an incredible sport, and it absolutely gives credit to not just their fearlessness, but true athleticism. But when sports doesn't exist for women, and there's no better example than what happened in Brazil, and I love this, and Marta is an amazing example. But so in 1999, for the Women's World Cup, which was a huge event, there was a lot of people saying, well, where are the Latina women? And they were absent. For many, many years, women played soccer alongside men in Brazil, but then in the 1940s, it was determined that women, it was not good for the reproductive system, that it would be harmful for them, and women were banned from playing soccer. And so they were subjugated to just their domestic roles, what is expected of women. And so this was a really horrible time in Brazil. There are so many incredible athletes, and yet if you look in the history books, but for one tennis player, they're non-existent because this was taken from them. And so, and as a radio commentator said, is basically they were just told these are the roles and this is what you have to do, and this is what they were allowed to do. But Marta, I love this quote. Because she says, I was unaware of my own experiences in fighting and overcoming endless gender barriers. And she talks about when she came back home after becoming an international sensation, and she comes back to her village, and she's picked up the mayor's there, and the fire truck brings her back into town, and she's overwhelmed because she sees the great impact. And please finish reading the quote, but the impact that she had on everyone. And she realized it wasn't just girls, but boys as well. And they started to realize that, everyone deserves these opportunities. And so we've seen what happens with women in sports when they're given the opportunity, not just in words, but they're given the platform, what can happen. And so we kind of go through and we get to see what happens with women in sports. And it's incredible what does happen. So hang on, because more's coming. Thank you, and get ready for the next series.